I think context is everything. Right, come to the conversation, have it a bit wider than just the request at hand. Let us understand a little bit about, right, what are the implications.
Welcome to Compromising Positions. I'm Leanne Potter, cyber anthropologist and cybersecurity professional at large.
And I'm Jeff Watkins, a cybersecurity enthusiast and CTO for a major tech consultancy. Together, we're the award-winning tech podcast that asks non-cybersecurity professionals what we in the industry can do to make their lives easier.
And help make our organisations more prepared to face ever-changing human-centric cyber threats.
This episode, we're joined by Scott Robertson, CFO.
That's Chief Financial Officer, for anyone that doesn't know.
Who's had a varied and interesting career, including working at Kin & Carter as well as CreateFuture CFO. And he's now retired, but we managed to convince him for one last jaunt before he enjoys that sweet freedom.
What a lovely retirement present for him.
Indeed. In this episode, CFO Secrets, how to secure your cybersecurity budget, we answer just that.
Very exciting because, as we all know, cybersecurity is expensive and it's not the easiest of functions to get budget for.
So if you've ever wanted to know the best time to ask for money,
hint, it's not during a cybersecurity incident,
or even what a CFO thinks of cybersecurity, then this episode is for you. We love this chat and we think you will do too. So sit back and enjoy our interview with Scott Robertson. Well, welcome to another episode of Compromising Positions. Today we have a very special guest with us, Scott Robertson. Scott is now enjoying his retirement, but up until very recently, he was the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer for CreateFuture, and I've worked with him for a number of years. So Scott, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yep, will do. Thanks, Jeff. And yeah, delighted to be a part of this podcast talking about kind of cybersecurity and CFO's kind of, I guess, view on that. In terms of myself then, so my background is I am a chartered accountant, have been for almost 30 years. I'm ex-PricewaterhouseCoopers, and since coming out of PwC, kind of about 2000, around about then, I've been involved in senior finance positions, particularly within the digital space over the last kind of 20, 25 years. So been quite an interesting kind of time. Seen it all from .com, everything in and around that, to financial crisis. During that period, I've been part of the kind of senior management teams that have bought and sold businesses. The business I was involved in sold out to what is now Kin & Carter back in 2014. And then, as Jeff says, in the last 3.5 years, I was CFO at CreateFuture, helping grow the business from, I think, just under 50 people to 500 in that period. So significant, exciting growth. And yeah, had the pleasure of working with Jeff over that period to help develop, grow the business and bring it on.
E-by gum, Scott. Flattery will get you anywhere.
It's kind of aim to please. £20 you owe me.
Well, I'm so glad that you're on the show because this is something I've wanted to discuss for a while, and it's something that comes up in, I don't know if you go to many cybersecurity conferences, Scott, but one thing that is always on panels, there's always a discussion about is, how do I ask for more budget? And you being a CFO, I think that's what kind of the meat of this conversation is going to be today. But first of all, what we always ask people is like, what does a CFO actually do? So what does a day in the life look like for you?
Yeah, okay. So I guess as CFO, you're responsible for safeguarding the assets of the business, of the company you're involved with. You're also heavily involved in risk management. So I think people assume that we're there counting numbers, and yeah, that forms a kind of significant part.
I'm going to say, that sounds very cybery, what you're discussing there. That sounds like we're kindred spirits. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think if you think about from the CFO's point of view, right, we are interested in numbers. We're interested in profit and loss. We're interested in the balance sheet. We're interested in, I guess, the worth of the business at a point in time. But we want it to be safe and financially secure. You know, that benefits the business and it benefits everybody that works within it. So we have a real alignment to our colleagues that work within kind of that cybersecurity sphere, because risk management plays an important part in it, always has done, from kind of, I guess, the early days of when businesses were adopting IT to where we're at now with AI heavily embedded within organisations as well. So yeah, it kind of goes hand in hand, but risk management is a significant part of what we're involved with, and that cuts across all areas of the business.
Yes, I guess you've, over the years as CFO, you've had to deal with a number of different cybersecurity teams, also people in cybersecurity, various different organisations. I mean, what have you found to be challenging about that relationship or way of working? What have you found to be good?
So it's interesting. I guess in the different businesses I've been involved with, they've all kind of been in that digital consultancy space, which means we have extremely talented and extremely well-educated IT professionals working within our organisation. And then in terms of the clients that we are working with as well, again, the majority of our client base over the last 20 years have been kind of blue chip financial institutions and I guess FTSE 100 within the kind of UK, but also global businesses as well. And what you have with that then, again, from an IT and a security perspective, again, you're getting people that are kind of working at top of their game in reality. So what you have then is you have a level of expertise and knowledge moving between both businesses. And from my point of view, if the CFO, sometimes that can be a challenge because trying to understand kind of latest developments, trying to understand the risks in those particular spheres, understanding just how the technology's moved on, keeping up to date, that can be one of the biggest challenges, I think, is just trying to kind of stay abreast of what's going on. And I guess maybe thinking about what the next question might be is how do you do that? Then form a close relationship with the people that are responsible for IT security within your organisation. Take the time to spend time with them, understand kind of what's changing in their world, what the risks are that they're seeing coming through, and then try and kind of understand from a CFO's point of view is what does that mean for the business as a whole, and then how do you mitigate against it? So staying abreast, understanding the kind of just how the world moves, I think is probably, it's one of the biggest, but it's one of the most interesting challenges as well, right?
Yeah, I guess taking the other side of that relationship, what do you think that cybersecurity professionals or the cybersecurity team could actually do to make your life easier when it comes to maybe helping you help them?
So I think as much as I want to understand what's going on in their world, I think it's useful for them to understand what's going on in the kind of CFO's world as well, the finance world. Understand, take the time to, how is the business performing? How are we trading? What does the market kind of look like? What are the conditions? Because these things typically set the scene for budgeting. And typically when you want to invest in IT, you want to invest in security, then you need to do that as part of the budget cycle. And again, if you want to be helpful in that regard, is be aware of what's going on in the business. Make sure that as you present risks, as you present solutions, that they take into account what's currently happening in the business. At the end of the day, if I could mitigate and prevent every risk, then we would, but it's not practical. So there's always a call, there's always priorities, you have different requests from different areas of the business that are important. So I think in terms of how, I guess, our colleagues within that IT infrastructure security space, how they can help us is be aware of that, try and take the time to understand from their colleagues, not just the CFO, elsewhere in the business, what's going on. What are the pressure points? What's going well, what isn't going so well, and just be mindful of that when we're looking at kind of requests.
So you talked about risk, and if you would throw the checkbook at all the risk eliminated, brilliant stuff. But how do I, as a cybersecurity person, sell you a risk, really? Aside from the business knowledge, if I'm coming to you, what do you want to see as a CFO? Do you want budgets? Do you want return on investment? Because some of that stuff's really hard to kind of quantify in a cyber security perspective, because kind of cyber, as I'm sure you're probably aware, is if nothing happens, it's brilliant, but it might not have happened anyways. When you're preventing things like, I'm going to buy this tool and it's supposed to keep us safe. Well, if nobody knocks on your door from a cybersecurity perspective for a year, then was it because of the tool or was it just because you were lucky? So how do I kind of sell like return on investment when I'm coming to you?
So it's interesting, right? Because risks, it falls into the kind of same line as with insurance as well, right? We all need to take out insurance in certain aspects of our life, whether it's from a personal point of view, your car, your house. Hopefully, car never gets stolen, never have an accident, house never goes on fire, right? But you need to quantify in your own mind what are the implications if those things were to happen, right? What's the financial impact associated with it? And that in turn then helps you determine how much you're prepared to spend in relation to it. So for example, if you've got a car that's worth £10,000 and it's £10,000 to insure it, you're not going to do it, right? It doesn't make sense. If the insurance is, maybe £500, approaching £1,000, then you may think, right, okay, what are the chances of an accident? Then, that's probably worthwhile. So that type of kind of looking at it maybe from an insurance point of view, bring that back then to the security risks. Okay, what is the risk of this particular event occurring? What's the financial impact that it could have on the company? So the return on investment is more difficult in that regard. Return on investment is probably more appropriate when you look at investing into infrastructure where you can see a commercial benefit to what you're investing in. So let's bring in the latest technology. It allows us to be kind of more agile. It allows us to deliver for our clients better. you can see that there's a kind of an associated benefit towards it. From a security point of view, then it's more managing, what if something goes wrong. So in order for me as a CFO to understand those risks, it's not necessarily quantifying the cost of what can go wrong, but it's maybe understanding just how likely is it, what is the impact. So it's that old kind of risk management piece, right? What is the impact? What is the likelihood? Will it causes reputational damage? Is it kind of loss of data? Is there potential fines kind of sitting behind it? And I think a lot of security risks probably tend towards that space of that reputational damage. And I think that for a business is hugely significant. So understanding the likelihood and the impact probably helps me understand better how much money we think we should be investing into that area.
Oh, very nice. So take heed, listeners. That's what you need to do to ask for your next budget. And does you touched upon as well earlier, like timing. So does timing matter as well? Lots of us don't, in cyber, don't follow the kind of business like financial model. We know that there's a financial year end, but that doesn't really mean anything to us except maybe we've got a bit of extra money to spend or no money to spend. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I understand that. And again, the CFO, the finance world, we tend to live from one finance year to the next. But again, coming back to that earlier point about what can our IT colleagues do to help themselves is understand the year end, understand the budget cycle, understand the kind of the process in and around it. Typically in most businesses, you'll have your annual budget get set. The work on that will probably start kind of 5 months before the end of the financial year in terms of what does it look like. And then it kind of ramps up. And then 2 months prior to the start of the financial year, things are kind of, in decent drafts to get signed off by the board and kind of approved and then kind of set in place. There's then typically a kind of half-year budget as well, where, whatever you thought was going to happen at the start of the year didn't quite turn out. Either things are a lot stronger and better, or things maybe aren't kind of what you expected, in which case you need to kind of readjust. So there's typically a couple of points in the year where if you have particular spend, if you highlight it soon enough, then it can be incorporated into the model, or certainly you can have a more meaningful discussion in and around it. I guess in finance, we typically don't like surprises. You get good surprises, bad surprises, but we like to have things planned out. We tend to kind of like to be in control. So again, you can help that by having those discussions in the early part of the process. So I think timing, Leanne, I think is extremely important, because I think it can absolutely kind of pave the way. If you come to me as I'm starting the budgeting process and say, look, there's this particular piece of software that's either coming to end of life, we need to kind of do something else, or there's this threat that we're seeing develop that we need to kind of do something about. We can then talk about, right, okay, what's the cost of that? We can go out for vendor selection. We can, you can cross quote. So you've got time to kind of have a proper position around that level of spend. Whereas if you come to me after the budget's set and you say, well, we'll get this imminent kind of risk, we need to do something about it now. Fine, if that's something that's just occurred and it's out of the blue, then yeah, we need to react. But if it's something we'd known about and we could have done something about, it's going to be much more difficult to get that into the budget. So timing is critical, is what I would say.
Yeah, but timing is critical, but what happens when something unexpected happens, which tends to happen in cyber?
Yeah. So I think when we do have unexpected events, right? So again, CFO, one of the roles that I play in that risk management is in and around the budget as well. So typically we'll have a budget that kind of sets out, right, here's us shooting the lights out. What does that look like? Here's a budget which maybe we're 10% down, 15% down, and where we expect it to be. What does that look like? And here's the budget which is kind of what we're setting ourselves middle of the road. We will typically have contingency within that in terms of kind of levels of spend. So that contingency, it may well be it sits within other departments, other areas, but if we have a critical event, then typically there's something we can do, in terms of that contingency we've got. And then equally, depending on the nature of it, there will be certain spend in the budget that isn't committed yet. So whilst it's there, we've not actually done it. It might be for the next quarter or the quarter ahead. And if that event that's coming through now is that important that we need to do something to correct against it or kind of protect ourselves, then we can look at future spend and we can say, right, okay, this is now more important than that, and that priority kind of call can be made. So what I would say in that regard, and I'm sure everyone will do this, but when we have these types of threats, we have these types of issues, raise them. The worst thing you can do is not raise them. As a CFO, I would rather know about every problem in the business so that we've got an awareness of it and we can help prioritise. And that's one of the benefits with kind of CFO CFO is you get to see what's going across all of the business. Whereas within the area that you might be working in, you're seeing what's important in your area. Somebody in marketing might see something in marketing, and so it goes. So there's an opportunity where I can potentially, with the rest of the board, make a priority call and say, look, that event over there is that significant. It now trumps these spends that we have over here, and we can try and deal with it. So I would say if it's significant enough, highlight it, and highlight it as soon as you can.
But I can't just go nab it. I can't say, I know you've got emergency budget somewhere, Scott. Give me it. I want a fancy new security tool.
Yeah, every CFO up on the land now is kind of jumping up and down saying, why did they say that?
Where we've worked best together in the past, it's been not been a matter of not being a no or a yes. It's been more like, what's the right timing to do this with regards to the risk and the proximity of that risk and the appetite as that risk moves on. As you said before, like there are some things that maybe actually are so unlikely that really you don't need gold plating. You don't need blue whale insurance on your car. That it's unlikely that a blue whale is going to fall on your car, but having other kind of insurance is really important. And where we've worked in the past, it's been like, well, what's the right time to do this for the business as we grow and as the risk surface? Quite often when you grow, the risk surface gets bigger as well.
Yeah, absolutely right. And this forms part of that dialogue that we need to have with all our colleagues, right? It needs to be open, honest. There needs to be transparency in and around it as well. At the end of the day, again, it's back to this point. If we want to manage risks, we need to understand them. We need to be aware of them. And in terms of where we spend money, we need to be pragmatic about it. We can't, it's very unusual to have an open checkbook. So typically, there's a level of spend which is appropriate. We just need to be pragmatic and realistic about it. I guess if we want to put in 27,001, for example, there's a level of cost associated with that across all areas. But maybe what we can do is identify, right, why are we putting in 27,001? Is it to satisfy kind of client contracts, or is it because we've got these perceived risks? If we have these perceived risks, can we tackle those at this point in time? Can we try and get work towards 27,001 as opposed to big bang, we're going for it, depending on kind of level of spend? So yeah, I think that dialogue and being pragmatic is important.
Yeah, and organisations, I think risk is a dirty word in organisations quite often, but I can't remember who it was, somebody on the show once said that innovation can't happen without risk. So I guess what's your generalised approach to it?
Listeners, I think that actual quote's from me. I just want to attribute that.
All right.
Because it's a good one. It's a good one. That's why I want to take credit for it.
Right, okay. So it's interesting, right? So in terms of risk within an organisation, it's taken extremely seriously at board level. We have risks matrices across the entire business, right? What are the showstoppers? What are the things that are going to cause us major issues? And cybersecurity will sit within that, either because it prevents us from working or there's reputational kind of aspects in around it. So it will flow up into that together with other risks. So it's taken extremely seriously. I don't think it's maybe not the dirty word that you think it might be, but it gets a lot of attention. I think then you need to consider in certain organisations, depending on the stage of the business, it will have a different perception and a different attitude towards risk. So as a CFO, I might go into a business where it's well established, there's a low appetite for risk and they want to run the business fairly safely. So they're not necessarily chasing kind of significant growth. They're happy to just move forward. And if they're looking at kind of acquisitions, then they might adopt a certain profile of acquisition, apply a certain risk profile towards it. They want a certain level of return. Equally, you can get into businesses that might be in startup mode where if they have the funding, then they can throw the kitchen sink at it, and their attitude to risk is we're going at it hell for leather. And then they just take a different view. They take a commercial standpoint on certain things, and that also might cut across into kind of IT security as well. It may well be like, we don't want to spend in this area because we want to focus on this side of it. We want to invest into the sales engine, we want to invest into marketing, and it's at the expense of this aspect over here. But inevitably, at a point in time, all businesses need to mature and they need to kind of balance it across all areas. So I think attitude to risk, differs from organisation to organisation. But one thing that sharpens it every single time is an actual event. If you have a cybersecurity event, I can tell you your risk attitude to that going forward, and probably your budget towards it going forward is slightly different.
Quite. That's what they often say, that the best thing that can happen to a cybersecurity team is either an incident happening or an incident happening in a competitor.
Yeah, exactly right. Where it just sharpens the attitude. And the other thing as well is even from clients' perspective, again, with the nature of some of the clients that we've worked with in the past, particularly in financial services, they have been subject to kind of security attacks, etc. And at a point in time, and it probably still it does exist now, then their suppliers become targets as well. They look for the kind of the weakest link. So whether you suffer an issue, whether your client does, whether a competitor does, all of these things kind of sharpen it. And it's a useful reminder, right, that these risks, while we think won't happen to us, they can, and when they do, they can be, they can be significant, they can be devastating.
Do you have any sort of lessons learned? Have you come across, obviously, about naming companies and things like that? And of course, not your last organisation. But do you have any lessons learned from working with the cybersecurity team on issues such as this?
Yeah, absolutely. And if I go back a kind of a number of years, then I would say the lessons learned are make sure you have your policies up to date. Get your IT security policy, bring it right up to date, and then it's not a bit of paper that you used to file in a kind of a drawer, right? Make sure it's a living, breathing artifact, right, that you're looking at, that you're working through. Again, where I've seen kind of businesses being caught out in the past is where it's you do something at a point in time and then you forget about it, and that if I even go back to my days back in PwC and in risk management services, back then one of the things we were testing is all your software up to date, is it all current? Back then it was about patching servers and kind of whatever else. I guess the world's moved on a little bit of that. Everything's kind of online now. You rely on your third parties to do that, but nonetheless, having appropriate policies in place that cuts across the last 20 odd years that I've been in this space is making sure that whatever you're saying that you're going to do in the policy, make sure you actually do it. And that's a point as well, right? For major blue chip clients, they can request to audit. Some of them they do expect to audit. So having your environment up to date, up to speed, that for me, Leanne, is a kind of the biggest lesson on this is don't just do something and you think, hey, we've done it, we can sit back. Wasn't that great? It's continual, it's evolving. And you'll know more than I do, right? The threats, there's always new threats, there's new vulnerabilities that are being identified.
You can't keep up, to be honest.
You can't keep up. So the best that you can do is take all the reasonable steps. And I think that's a kind of the biggest lesson in this is, it goes back to the other part of the conversation actually, keep up to date, keep up to speed, and make sure that your environment you're keeping up to date as well.
And I guess that's where things like cyber insurance kind of comes into play as well, which I'm sure you in your roles would have to sign off at some point. And the nice thing about cyber insurance, some people say, is it worth its money, if they pay out or not, because it's quite stringent. But the nice thing about cyber insurance is even if a small business has it, is it has guidelines. It says, no, before I'm going to let you have any cyber insurance, you must meet these basic requirements. Now, it's not meeting those basic requirements doesn't mean you're necessarily secure, but it's a good start. And those kind of, you talk about compliance and sort of like doing right by the customer, being kind of enforced to do so is also kind of a good way down that route, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and we see this all the time in our kind of cyber policies. They require a certain standard, otherwise you're not getting covered. And that's the point as well. You may be covered at a point in time, but then if you don't maintain those standards, if you don't maintain that compliance, then you're going to fall out of cover. Again, I've never been in that position. I've never had to kind of call upon it, thankfully. But it's there as, it's a useful tool in making sure you remain up to date. Similarly, particularly in the space that I've worked in the last 20 years, where in that IT consultancy space, digital consultancy, our clients, the contracts are much more sophisticated now as well. You will see in every schedule, in every master services agreement, there is a schedule specific to IT security, and they either expect you to have the kind of 27001 accreditation, or they will expect that you're meeting the majority of what sits within there. And again, that's kind of, from my point of view, it's responsible kind of vendor management by our customers, right? Because ultimately, again, financial services client base that they have, they need to obviously take it seriously, and that needs to flow down into the vendors they work with. And again, me as a consumer of either the banks that I personally bank with, I want to know that they're kind of adopting that level of control. So I think that also provides a useful, compliance aspect for some of the smaller companies as well, but also it holds some of the larger companies to account as well.
Aye, it certainly does. And it's good to hear that you've never had to utilise it. Now, you have more than just a passing interest in the activities that the cybersecurity team are doing. Didn't you do the ISACA exam?
I did, yeah. So
And I think your words was it was brutal. Now I'm sure some listeners have done it as well, but do tell us a little bit about your experience and doing that.
yeah, so this was back in my kind of the PwC days. I think it may actually been Coopers and Lybrand before they became PwC. I thought after I qualified as an accountant, that was the last exam I would ever do. Joined their risk management services division. I had a focus on IT security, and I was told, yep, you need to go and do the ISACA exam. So there I was, off having to kind of read through an unbelievably large volume of text in and around information systems, controls, auditing. And then there was a multiple choice. I think the multiple choice was like 250 questions. It was, to be fair, it was multiple choice, which is always good, right? But nonetheless, it was an outrageous number of questions. Glad to report that I passed.
Well
And
done.
yeah, indeed. And for the kind of, I guess, for the time that I was in kind of that professional consultancy, yeah, I maintained that kind of standard. And it was useful, right? So here's the thing. Back then, we were involved. There was one particular project I was involved in which took the ISACA, that was the control and objectives, married it up to BS 7799 as it was back then, to apply that into kind of major PLC within the UK. That project ran for almost a year, and it was significant for what the PLC were kind of looking to do to bolster their IT security. You know, it's really interesting work. And then as I moved out from professional practice into industry, I was able to take that understanding, that expertise, and apply it. And I think that's why, from a CFO point of view, I've got that real interest within part of that risk management, IT security. Yeah, it's stayed with me for kind of a number of years. That's for sure. I'm sitting in my office. I'm looking to see if I have my old auditing books. I don't think I do. Actually, Jeff, I think I passed them on to Dan Llewellyn as he stepped into the IT security
Yes, he
role.
mentioned that you gave him a book, and he was very grateful for it.
I did.
Yeah, but also, you know, I think you love to live a dangerous life, because you also are a data controller at CreateFuture as well, weren't you? And I guess it all feels like between the three of those things, those control kind of most of the risk in an organization.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the kind of the life of the CFO, right? Is so we touched on this as well, right? Is surprises. You know, we don't typically like them. We want to be in control. We want to kind of know what's going on, and that applies back on the kind of data controller role as well, right? You take that position on, you take it on with kind of, I guess, in kind of recent years in particular, that role has become much more important. And it's interesting. It's not just from kind of the data that we hold, but also when you're working with clients, if you're holding their data, then you need to be extremely responsible with that as well. And again, it's something that I've seen over probably the last kind of 10 to 15 years, just the importance of that. I've seen how it's become much more significant within organizations as well, just because the flow of data now is a lot quicker probably than what it used to be. You know, certainly if I go back 20 odd years ago when the internet was just coming out, you know, people were still faxing information to each other, whereas now it's just there, it's instantaneous. So yeah, that data controller role becomes really important for clients, important for the business, important for our colleagues as well. You know, that's another point as well. Organizations carry a lot of personal data about the individuals that work within there. Need to be extremely careful with that as well.
And recognizing, as you were saying earlier, that, you know, your job is to look after the assets of the business, and your data is an asset. It might not be as tangible as, you know, having a property somewhere, the desks, the tables, you're the CFO of a factory, all the machines and things like that. But this tangible asset, and reframing that, I think sometimes we can kind of forget how intangible a lot of the value is in a business, even though it's incredibly valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And that goes some way to kind of when businesses are valued, right? The level of goodwill that's associated with it. If you look at a balance sheet and you just add up the value of those tangible assets, they might arrive at a certain number. If you then look at the intangible aspect to it, whether that's the R&D, the kind of the investment everybody's put into kind of growing certain areas of a business, to the goodwill of the kind of the brand that you've built. Yeah, the value of that in most instances will surpass the value of the assets that are being acquired, unless it's a kind of a heavy, capital intensive business. So you're absolutely right, Leanne.
I'm going to put you on the spot then, Scott. You were talking earlier when we were discussing, like, so how do I sell you, like, this might be a reputational risk. How do I put, as a cybersecurity person, how do I put a value on reputation? How do I come across that figure if I want to come and impress you and say, I thought about this, Scott, I really need this to protect our business, and it's the reputational damage is going to be? And yeah, how do I get that number? How do I say that if I'm probably not privy to those conversations at my level?
Yeah, I think it would be extremely difficult. And in terms of putting me on the spot, it would also probably be difficult for me as well to put a value on it too. Normally, when you look at those those goodwill values, it's typically when you consider either if a business is being sold, if it's being acquired, then what's the value associated. That's not to say we always typically have a view as to what a business's worth is based on what's happening in the marketplace. But in terms of kind of that reputational damage, putting a value on it, then typically probably wouldn't. But what you probably want to understand is, right, okay, what does it actually mean? Does it mean we're going to lose in a particular sector, that particular client or those particular clients, right? We can put a value on that. We can look at how much they're spending with us. So if we were holding data against a particular client, we know that client's spending, I don't know, 5 million a year with us, and we have a breach in that data, we're going to lose the client. Well, there's a straight 5 million that we can put a number on. Again, from your point of view, Leanne, that might be more tricky for you to come up with a value. But what you could certainly say is, look, if we have a breach here, if we have an issue, that client there is going to be affected. That client there's a risk that we could lose them. And that would probably make me sit up and take note.
Is there any value in me saying... So one thing I found very useful, let me roll back. One thing I found very useful is if someone of a similar industry has had an incident and you can see what the cost was there. I'm going to use the British Library as an example because they did a fantastic job, and I will sing their praises till the cows come home about how they handled their incident. They were so transparent about it, so that's why I'm using that as an example. But if I come to you and say you were another private library, for example, I said, well, this is what happened to the British Library, this is where it cost them. Would that be any use for you, me coming from my position to a CFO and saying, this is why I think we should care about this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that forms part of the education of the CFO, right? So that's an area, particularly within your sphere, you have a real interest in it. You may have peers that are working over there that you're in contact with. There's maybe a personal aspect to it. You just maybe have a much better understanding and level of knowledge than I ever would have. So I would welcome that type of information in terms of what that costs elsewhere, in terms of what that position is. It's relevant to compare and contrast. Right, it may well be British Library. Okay, it's a different business to kind of our organisation. However, if it's subject to, I don't know, for example, a ransomware attack, right, it then locks down. It shut down certain systems for X amount of time. Never mind the cost to bring it back up, right, but it just shut down the organisation for 2 days, 3 days, 5 days, 10 days. It took us 3 months to get back up to speed. It took us 6 months. That type of information is relevant if we thought that, for example, we may be at risk from ransomware, or we thought we were at an increased risk of it, or if we thought that we're that reliant on certain systems that if this was to happen, that would be the impact. Yeah, it would absolutely be relevant.
Good. I'm just trying to find ways of like how do I actually physically do this?
So every CFO in the land's going to get a heart attack now in the run up to Christmas as they get bombarded with all of those wrong.
Well, yes.
We're going to see insurance
but
policies.
You're out of the game now, Scott. So it's all right. Do what you like.
Agreed. Yeah. I can give away all the secrets now. But no, look, it's that communication side, right? For me, it's the kind of it's the transparency of what's going on. It's the kind of the dialogue and the understanding, and it's the practical reality of what we see. And then it's how do we apply that to our own organisation. So I think it's really useful to have these types of conversations. And again, if a CFO isn't engaging in the conversation, one, I'd be really disappointed because I don't think they're fulfilling their role properly. But equally, if we felt that, if you can't get an audience, then look for elsewhere within the finance team. Look at their kind of number two, look at the deputy, because they're probably involved in kind of sorting out the insurance. They're probably kind of involved in things on a more day-to-day basis. So use that to your advantage. Equally, use other board members as well, where you can, to surface risks, because that's what it comes down to. But I'd be surprised. CFOs typically, they will want to know, they will want to listen, they will want to understand what's happening kind of in the wider marketplace.
I think ideally is when you're building your cybersecurity committee, it'd be good to have somebody from the high up in the finance team as part of it. So operations, obviously, because operating part of it, one of the things I was thinking of there when you're talking about what's the cost of shutdowns, well, what's your BCDR plan? And of course, BCDR plan is hugely affects financial performance. If there's a cost every single day, any company doesn't operate, isn't there? And having somebody who's in full command of what's going on, rather than just being given a slideshow or a request for an extra whatever a budget, having somebody who's fully bought in, fully on board with what's going on with those kind of, especially in the cybersecurity committees, can be really valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in terms of that, the business continuity, disaster recovery, it's always one of these ones, right? It's difficult to imagine, a particular event happening, but they do happen. But you can break that down into kind of smaller areas as well, right? We should test that's other things. Oh, you were saying, Leanne, earlier on, right? What can we do? What are the lessons learned? Testing these plans, right? Doesn't mean you need to test every aspect of it, but test areas of it that you think are probably at more risk than others, right? So what happens if we lose the internet then? What happens if we lose our connectivity, right? We all typically rely on it. What are the implications of that? What are the fallback systems that we had? Organisation I was involved in 10, 15 years ago, we had 2 lines coming into the office from 2 different suppliers to deal with that. Nowadays, then you can probably look at kind of mobile devices and kind of what have you, if that's the case. But it's one thing talking about it and saying, yeah, we can do that. It's another thing when it actually happens, in terms of the scrambling involved, the time that's lost. And again, my own experience, kind of that digital kind of consultancy business, our revenue is based on the time that we're spending on our client work. If we lose half a day, if we lose a day, it's not just that I've lost half a day and things are delayed. There's an actual cost associated with that. So again, I guess coming back to that conversation with the CFO, these things are relevant. You can quantify that and they can consider it as well in terms of what should we or shouldn't we do in and around these areas.
And I think there's also maybe a misconception that executives don't want to be spoken to or consulted or have the debates or discussions about these kind of things, which I don't know. I've never seen that to be true. I think there's sometimes a difference in the language used. I think our very first live guest, Kevin Bear, discussed this quite well. He talked about kind of the exec are thinking at the more business strategy level, business direction. And quite often people, either in operations or in delivery of whatever services you deliver, are thinking more day to day. But then there is kind of this slight language barrier. But I think people still want to be involved.
Yeah, absolutely. And the exec need to understand, and they want to understand what's going on elsewhere in the business on a day-to-day basis. Because fundamentally, the business doesn't exist as a result of the exec. And the business doesn't necessarily succeed or fail by the exec. I mean, obviously it can and take it to extremes, but by and large, the exec is a tiny part of your overall organisation. Businesses kind of succeed and fail because of what the work that everyone else is doing. That's the reality. There's typically your exec, 10 people against kind of 500 type idea, so they need to, it's useful for them to understand what's happening elsewhere on a day-to-day basis. And every exec team that I've sat in, they're always keen to have touch points elsewhere within the business. I know that from my own perspective, I was always keen to speak to kind of our developers. I was keen to speak to people that were working on projects. I was keen to understand what was happening on the ground, just because it gives you a sense, you get a better sense as to what's going on. So coming back to the point about the dialogue and what they're thinking, kind of what have you, then strategy is important. That forward direction, absolutely important. But there's a day-to-day part of the business that you need to understand as well, and we need to make sure is working well.
Well, I think it's been a really interesting conversation, and I think hopefully people will take away from this that actually the CFO and in general the finance team aren't actually so far away from cybersecurity and maybe from things like data security. Scott loves to live dangerously and have plenty of risk in his life. And actually, we're all human beings and we do want to be part of that dialogue. We want to be part of that conversation. And I think a lot of it is around the storytelling. And it's not just, don't just turn up with a request for an expenses sign off. A lot of it's the storytelling.
Yeah, I would agree. I think context is everything. Right, come to the conversation, have it a bit wider than just the request at hand. Let us understand a little bit about, right, what are the implications? If we have experience of other competitors, other areas that we can bring that to life a little bit better, then that helps as well. And in fact, when I think about it, I guess one of the tactics that I used frequently when speaking in areas that I didn't fully understand the technology was say, bring it to life, help me understand. Right, what does that mean on a kind of the day-to-day basis, and break it down. So Jeff, you talked a little bit about the difference in language. That kind of goes both ways. So the easier that you can make it for me as a CFO to understand, then the more likely I am to be able to help find a solution for it as well.
Oh, thank you very much.
Just before we go, I'd also like to hope that by the end of this conversation and people going away, then all of a sudden we'll just see in the news that cybersecurity budgets have skyrocketed for the first time ever, and everyone's getting everything they wanted for Christmas. So thank you so much, Scott. It's been wonderful.
And
I do hope our listeners do take heed, because it is honestly the thing that is, aside from any kind of discussions about ransomware and phishing, how do we get people in the exec on board? How do we get budgets approved? that is the biggest conversation in cyber. Wherever I go, it's always asked. So thank you so much for your secret insights, Scott. It's been really great.
No, thank you. Thanks, Leanne. Thanks, Jeff. Really enjoyed the conversation. Yeah, and if I can be of any help going forward, then by all
Well, I was
means,
going to say, if people want to reach out to you, how can they do that?
probably through LinkedIn is probably the best way to do that. And in terms of this recording and what you said way back at the start, I'll probably update my LinkedIn profile. So edit. Yeah, that'd probably be the way to do it. But I'll need to I'm not even sure what the correct address is for it. I'll need to look that out.
No worries. I will find you in a kind of Liam Neeson Taken style, and I will post your details on the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I mean, now you're retired, maybe all requests should be sent to Dev Null.
Aye, exactly. That's exactly what it should.
for the geeks out there. Well, thank you very much, Scott. Hope you enjoy your retirement.
Yep. No, thanks very much. I'm sure I will.
There we go. All those panels and talks at cybersecurity conferences can now stop. We've cracked the code, how to get your foot in the door when it comes to asking for budget for your function.
Yep. Shape your ask in a way that makes it make sense to the business. Build strong relationships so you can start having those conversations, and of course, time it right, because timing is everything.
It certainly is. So, let us know, listeners, how you get on, and if you're a vendor, enjoy the spoils of this newfound cybersecurity budget that'll be popping up everywhere. Now, from cybersecurity budgets to movie budgets. Yes, listeners, you won't want to miss our next episode, which happens to also be our season finale. Back by popular demand, we've got software developer and technology film expert Simon Painter. He's back with us again for another edition of Hack the Planet, the best and worst hacker movies reviewed. And boy oh boy, have we got a treat for you.
Yep, from Johnny Mnemonic to The Italian Job.
From Hidden Gem, Paperman, to a film that should just remain hidden, Swordfish.
Ugh. And then to Jason Statham's latest offering. Yes, Leanne finally let me watch it. The Beekeeper.
I'm so generous. Expect lots of implausible hacking, spirit fingers on keyboards, and of course, elite hacker dolphins.
You won't want to miss it, and neither will your cybermates, so do share the show so you can host your own cyber movie night along with us.
I'd love that. Now, I can't wait for this. This is going to be a banger of a season finale. But in the meantime, we hope you enjoyed this episode. See you next time. Keep secure, and don't forget to ask yourself, am I the compromising position here?